Good afternoon. Today is Monday, the 12th of August, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, and I'm delighted to have with me Diane, Rasmussen, McAdie from Scotland and Ben Rubin from London. Now, I'm just going to say that I did mention last week I was going to do an update on Ukraine. I'm not going to do that today. It will be on Wednesday. Obviously, some very interesting events unfolding with the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk area, but other very serious things happening on the battlefield, but I'll cover that on Wednesday. We decided that today the focus should be on UK. We're really in a war in this country, and as I've said before, in my opinion, that is a war against our own politicians. But let's hear what Nigel Farage had to say on the subject of Keir Starmer and immigration.
So Starmer's going to get tough. We're going to treat the trafficking gangs as if they are terrorists. We're going to take the lead in Europe. Goodness me, I've heard that before. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to sign back up to Europol. Not Interpol, no, Europol, the EU's own police force. And we will take our share of asylum seekers crossing the Mediterranean, coming in to the European Union. We'll be signing up for the EU refugee programme, something we weren't even in as members of the European Union. And given that yesterday 6,800 people landed in Lampedusa, Italy alone, I suspect the number, even if the boat stopped, the numbers coming would be even bigger than now. We're going back into EU programmes. He won't solve a thing.
Well, totally agree with him. It won't solve a thing, but what would be nice is if Nigel Farage would get into the real detail as what's happening, because the illegal immigration is a tiny fraction of the overall migration, and that migration is planned policy throughout the European Union. Indeed, it's a globalist policy, as we've highlighted several times before. But Nigel's certainly right to be warning about Starmer getting involved with Europol, because this is dragging us deeper into the EU. And we can be sure that if Europol is being engaged in matters to do with immigration, Europol will be engaged in matters to do with terrorism. And as most people in the UK now understand, Starmer is prepared to label anybody who gets out of hand or challenges his policies, his government, as a terrorist. So this is very dangerous times. But let's just jump back a little bit and see what Keir Starmer was saying while he was still in the position of shadow leader.
Would Labour be prepared to negotiate with the 27 EU nations on an asylum seeker burden sharing scheme so that Britain does its bit within the wider international context?
I think it's important to distinguish between the arrangements within the EU for EU members, which we're not part of and we won't be part of, and sitting outside that, a returns agreement of some sort. Now, everybody knows we need a returns agreement. The Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that we need a returns agreement, and that would have to be negotiated. We're in opposition, we're not in a position to negotiate that, and that's not what I've been talking about today. But I accept that that's a discussion that needs to take place. The Prime Minister knows that's a discussion that needs to take place, but the terms of that would have to be negotiated as we went along. But it wouldn't be as if we were a member of the EU, because we're not a member of the EU.
So I'd just like to ask the audience, is this man just confused? He doesn't really understand what he said previously, or is he actually lying? It's so difficult to tell. We're not part of, but what is he absolutely doing? He's burrowing his way back into the European Union as fast as possible. So let's have a look at him in action here.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced €99 million in funding to tackle illegal migration. Starmer said to stop illegal migration, we must also tackle it at source. The money will fund projects across Africa and the Middle East and includes humanitarian and health support and access to education. Starmer was speaking to the leaders of 45 countries at the European Political Community Summit in Oxfordshire.
So there we are, an EU political summit brought into Oxfordshire and Keir Starmer deep into it. What has happened? Well, the EU is still wrapped around us, and Keir Starmer is going to make sure that those chains are pulled even tighter around people in UK. Let's look at just some of the headlines as legacy media did actually pick up at least some of the things going on here, because whilst headline in the first one is the terrorist gang, this is about the chats with Europol, supposedly on immigration, but is it really? And then we can see we've got Sky News talking about sites on a closer relationship with Europe. Keir Starmer aims to repair European bridges that the Tories have burnt. Keir Starmer plots deal to take EU migrants from the Telegraph. And UK's Starmer hails European unity on Ukraine, tackling migration. And of course, many people coming out of Ukraine into Europe and indeed onto UK. Well, what did the UK column have to say about Brexit back in 2018?
That they want a veto over future trade deals signed by the UK. So in other words, if the UK signs a trade deal with a country that the EU has a trade deal with, the EU is suggesting that they want the power to veto some aspects of those trade deals that Britain might do with other countries.
Yeah, it's Brexit without the exit, I think we're looking at, Mike.
I think that's absolutely it.
So I think we're allowed to say the UK column absolutely on the button back then. We saw it for what it was. We called it out for what it was. It was not Brexit with an exit. There was no exit in what was done. And Keir Starmer, of course, knows this, and he's going to continue to lock us even deeper into EU controls. Now, have a look at what he's doing to the UK public. This is a Telegraph reporter's article here. You'll be refused bail even if you only watch riots from the sideline. Judge warns whether an active participant or curious observer, anybody involved in disorder will be locked up. Now, that was told a Belfast court, but let's just have a look at this clip at an event, a simple event, but very telling, this side of the water.
We've got to stand up against this. We've got to come together and stand up against this.
Guys, watch the papers tomorrow or today.
I don't know, it's Wesley Winters.
What the media will say about this. But look, all on camera.
He's been doing a mega job.
Against British people. After documenting the whole event and standing in the same spot for about 10 more minutes, the police then decided to do this.
He's been covering all the behind the scenes stuff of this, and look at this.
Disorder, mate. What are you doing arresting me?
Arresting for a public disorder for filming.
Well, there you have it, public disorder for filming, and it's only going to get worse under Keir Starmer. Free speech is being destroyed. Just a little clip here from Margaret Thatcher talking on the subject of immigration. I'm going to talk over it for people who are just listening into the news, but let's play it. So she's saying those who are genuine refugees, and that's determined by the United Nations, will not be returned. Those that are legal migrants will be returned, and it is customary international law for countries to receive their own immigrants back into their country. And if he, the right honourable gentleman, is suggesting that we ever get to a position when you cannot return illegal immigrants to their country of origin, then he is proposing international chaos. And that, of course, is what it is, calculated chaos. So, Ben, good point to bring you in, because we're clearly under attack by our own government. And the key tactic at the moment is anybody who dares to speak out or challenge Starmer's government is a far right-wing extremist. What's your thoughts?
We're all far right now. That was a great opening segment, Brian. Thank you. The gentleman being arrested for filming what was going on the street level, I think, is very telling, because the government don't want you seeing what's happening on the street. And I think it's because they might well be coordinating it. And I'm going to talk to you about that. And I think draw some dots together, draw some information together which supports that analysis. So last week, we were certainly presented with the story of an organic and spontaneous anti-fascist uprising in response to riots across the north of England, in response to the far-right thugs and fascists that are our fellow citizens, according to the people in power. I was sent this message by someone from the Jamaican community, which was doing the rounds on Wednesday, and we can see here a supposed call out from a far-right group telling people to come together at 39 locations from Aldershot to Wigan, all around the UK, in order to push back against immigration, saying they won't stop coming until you tell them, mask up, get out on the street. All right, this was sent to me, and it'd be doing the rounds across the whole of London, so far as I can tell. Actually, a lot of people talking about this. It was very well distributed. And then in response to that, we saw a whole bunch of street-level activity. Most notably for me, this event up in Walthamstow, which is just around the corner from where I live. Here we have Paul Mason, former political editor at Channel 4 News, a former BBC man as well, talking about an event in Walthamstow Central, 10,000 people, peaceful, calm, determined, the actual working class of East London. Hashtag hope not hate. Now, let's just remind ourselves who Paul Mason is for a start. I'm going to come back to him a couple of times in this presentation. The first thing you need to know about him is that he is actually a confirmed MI6 asset. Yeah, so this is someone who works with military intelligence. I also like to reference the fact that there are actually very few working class people in Walthamstow these days. The average house price is about £800,000. And in this video, all I can see is a bunch of fashionistas. Yeah, this look like the sort of average Shoreditch people who work in design agencies or that kind of thing, right? So the idea that this is some kind of spontaneous working class uprising, I think, is just a bit far-fetched. I did go up to go and take a look. I didn't want to, but I thought I'd best, given it was happening. This is a photo that I took. Big crowd. Let me zoom in a little bit. There certainly were thousands of people. 10,000? Yeah, maybe, actually. There were a lot of people out on the street. But it was a very strange atmosphere. When my coming away from it, I made a little film I shared on my Telegram, and the word that I used was dead. It felt like a dead atmosphere. There was no one to be in opposition to, right? So all these people have come out in order to stare down the fascists, but there were no fascists at all on the street. There were a few people in the crowd speaking in hushed tones about the fact that maybe someone from the EDL had been spotted in this part of London or that part of London, but there were no fascists, there were no EDL supporters, which is actually, unsurprising given the fact that the EDL doesn't exist anymore. It was disbanded in 2014, right? So this is a bit of a bogeyman here. It feels like this is a story that's been concocted for a specific reason. And actually, it turns out the whole thing probably was a hoax, right? So this is Nick Lowles from Hope Not Hate. I mentioned Hope Not Hate earlier because Paul Mason used the hashtag, so there may be some link here. And we spoke about this fella last week because he shared a false story about acid being thrown on Muslim women in the north of England, which was a deliberate provocation as far as I can tell. And he says that it was a hoax. But just look at the front pages of today's papers. An anti-racist message is being transmitted to millions of homes this morning. That's a big propaganda win. And anti-racism, by the way, that is just Marxism when you dig into it. So we had wall-to-wall support for the anti-fascists across even the right-wing press. My goodness, the Daily Mail got in on the act, right? People presenting this like it's some kind of huge moral victory for the nation. But actually, what did we see on the streets? A lot of this kind of thing, actually. There are a lot of armed gangs of immigrants roaming around in places like Sheffield and Stoke. And then what popped up the next day? This video, which came from the Walthamstow protest.
They hurt. We've got children and women using those trains, destroying some relatives. They are disgusting, nasty fascists, and we need to cull their throats and get rid of them all. I just want to say thank you all. I'm going to leave it now. And free! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! Free, free! Palestine! Thank you, God bless you all. Thank you so much.
So that was a fellow called Ricky Jones calling for political dissidents that he calls Nazis to have their throats cut, right? That is a criminal offence. So he's a Labour councillor in Dartford. or I should say he was a Labour councillor in Dartford, because he's been suspended, as we'll find out in a minute. Back in 2021, I've done a little bit of digging into this guy. He got the sniffles in 2021, he got COVID, and he participated in what is basically a propaganda exercise. I recommend going to watch this short video. It's only a couple of minutes, and we'll put a link to it in the comments. As I said, he was suspended by Dartford Labour. They said that they're aware of a video circulating. The behaviour is completely unacceptable. He's been suspended from the Labour Party, and they're not going to be making any further comment. All of the replies were locked, so there's no discussion over here. And then the next day, actually, it was on the same day that the video appeared, on the 8th, he was arrested. Yeah, so the Met Police saying that a man's been arrested at an address in South London. He was held on suspicion of encouraging murder and for an offence under the Public Order Act at a peace rally, of all things. Isn't that remarkable? So anyway, we'll come back to Ricky Jones. We'll let you know how that develops. But I think it tells you quite a bit about the tone of things and where that's coming from, actually. Let's go back to this image. So there were two things that jumped out at me here. The first one is that is an Amnesty International high-vis vest. Yeah, now I don't know who that woman is. I don't know if she works at Amnesty International, but she's certainly been associated with the message that he delivered. And Amnesty International was set up to protect political dissidents. But Ricky there has just said that he wants to kill political dissidents. The optics here are absolutely appalling. Amnesty have not thus far made any kind of statement about this. I've been onto their Twitter page and they've not posted anything since the 7th of August. And I think they need to make a statement. So actually this afternoon, I'm going to be contacting Sasha Deshmukh, who I used to work with, by the way. Hi, Sasha, who is the chief executive of Amnesty UK. So I think that they need to come out very firmly on the side of, on the right side of this, frankly. Who else have we got in frame? So this woman laughing about the throat cutting. That's Jo Cardwell. She's a radical Marxist, and she was the chief steward of the event. She was actually running the event. She was the senior official there organising things on the ground. As I say, she's a political operative. She's been working very closely with the Green Party recently, and she was a part of the team working with this gentleman, Mohsin Ali, who's the lead city councillor for Gipton and Hare Hills for the Green Party, and he was voted in back in May. And I think this image is quite revealing, actually, because we have some quite irate immigrant gentlemen in the foreground, and then you have a grinning Marxist in the background looking at all of the chaos unfolding. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful image, actually. So who else was talking about this? Reuters got in on the act. They actually had a quotation from Jo Cardwell, who they describe as a volunteer at Stand Up Racism. And she's basically coming out and saying, this is a scale of attack that we have never seen before. Right? They're really using this as an opportunity to terrorize the population and to turn people against each other. And it is absolutely unacceptable. And it's all coming from, at least in part, I think, this organization, Stand Up to Racism. They've been producing these signs, and they're clearly extraordinarily well backed, because you don't leave that much timber and print by the side of the road every weekend, and they are all around the country every weekend, providing protesters with these signs, and that doesn't come for free, right? You know, there's a lot of money getting used here. Very little information about them on their website. The whole thing is run on Gmail accounts. Right? They've got 50 locations around the UK, but there's no formal email address. But then actually, when you do dig into it properly, and this came from a gentleman called Sean Finch, who found out that actually the former president of this organisation that has been organising these counter protests is Diane Abbott. Yeah, the very senior Labour MP for Hackney North. And this organisation is directly linked into something called Unite Against Fascism, the British anti-fascist group. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Stand Up to Racism, there's actually nothing there. It takes you directly to this organisation. Heavy union links. It's co-chaired by a couple of people, including Talha Ahmad of the Muslim Council of Britain, who should probably step in, actually, because I found this article that he wrote in 2015, which says there is nothing liberal about calling for execution without regard to due process, which is what Ricky Jones has just done at your event, sir. Anyway, it's going to keep on escalating. They've got a big fundraiser coming up on Saturday with Jeremy Corbyn in Dalston in London. They've been active this past weekend. We've got Paul Mason back outside the Reform HQ in central London with signs that we've just talked about. And actually, let's go back to Paul Mason, because I think he's absolutely crucial in all of this. So what's he talking about? He wants the government to enact the full Online Safety Act with no more consultations. He wants heavy censorship. And who's pulling his strings? We've already talked about MI6, but maybe it's this guy in his Twitter handle.
Well, Ben, thank you very much. Obviously, a lot that people need to research to really understand what's causing the angst and trouble in this country. We've got more analysis coming up in today's news. But of course, another period where people were attacked, their mental health was attacked, their whole psychology was attacked, was in lockdown. So welcome to today's news, Diane. What have you got to tell us about the Scottish COVID inquiry?
Hello, Brian and Ben. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so we need to be doing some coverage, I think, over the next period, actually, about both COVID inquiries, both in the UK and in Scotland. But I think Scotland in particular, they have let some things slip out that maybe the government wouldn't have wanted to be slipped out. But let's look at this a little bit. And what I plan to do over time is some more in-depth analysis of the hearings and the transcripts and the witness statements that are coming out. But we have a long way to go in getting through the inquiry. So first, let's look at, according to the Scottish COVID inquiry website, what is a public inquiry? So we're pretty clear here that it can investigate what's going on, but it is also expected to report on its findings and make recommendations for improvements in the future. So what we're saying here is, well, next time we have a pandemic, I'll put that in inverted commas, we don't want this to happen again. No, of course we don't. So what exactly is going on with this inquiry, and what are they doing? If we look at the terms of the Scottish inquiry, they've done it separately from the UK inquiry, and that's because ministers in Scotland had devolved powers that were different in some ways, or in addition to what happened in the UK. And so, for example, the administration of vaccines was some of it was devolved and some of it was UK wide. For those of you who lived in Scotland, as I did during the 2020 to 22 period, we know that the restrictions were much stricter up here in Scotland than they were down south, which was very, very difficult for people, not for the reasons of a deadly virus, but for the reasons of the isolation and the other consequences that we all experienced through that time period. We see in the next slide here that the inquiry is now going into its next phase. Even though this covers the period from January 2020 to the end of 2022 for the so-called COVID period, we have now just moved into our permanent hearing space in July of 2024. So we're just getting started. Obviously, we now have a permanent home. So who knows how long this is going to last for, investigating what happened to a small country. There are ways if you could get involved in the inquiry at different levels. We see here core participants, which have a wider range of responsibility in terms of looking at the evidence, looking at anything that's provided in advance in writing. There are 3 themes within the inquiry. The first one has just been completed earlier this summer, which is health and social care. There are 2 more to go, so we're only about a third of the way through the hearings if we want to look at it that way. I am interested in contributing to the one on education in young people because I saw firsthand the detrimental, terrible effects it had on the university students that I was directly responsible for. For example, when I had to deal with their suicidal feelings, some of them were wanting to take their own lives because they were stranded in residence halls. And I could not do anything as a university program director other than send them an email address. I couldn't even send them to a counseling office or even give them a phone number for campus counseling services at the time. So for me, that was really difficult. And so obviously, even more difficult for the students who are losing their youth on being locked up in residence halls and other places. But that all said, there is a man called Dave, the independent researcher. His X handle is Biology Phenom. So I would encourage all of you to go and check out the extensive video clips and evidence that he's been collecting. Unfortunately, it's really hard to summarize video clips because there are so much of them and so many transcripts, but this is what I'm going to hopefully be working on over time. So we have just a couple of minutes here summarizing some of the findings from this first stage of the inquiry from Health and Social Care. If we could play that video, please.
We anticipate the inquiry will hear that people were pressured to agree to do not resuscitate notices, that people were not resuscitated even though no such notice was in place, that residents may have been neglected and left to starve.
So yeah, he did know because it terrified him.
Right. And do you know if he was asked once or if he was asked on a number of occasions?
5 times.
5 times. 5 times that night? Or
5 times within 24 hours.
Aye, that's what I says to him. I says, my mum's no dying of COVID. My mum's dying of starvation and dehydration.
By the next winter, we were back to square one. There was lots of people not getting in. There was lots of people who were, they'd really get into isolating people really badly that year. I mean, that was terrible. There was people being isolated people were coming in the group saying, my mum's been stuck in a room for 45 days.
I got a phone call from the care home to say that my dad was failing. He was agitated, he'd been shouting for help, he'd been wandering into other rooms, so he was still mobile. They'd found him on his hands and knees trying to get to the toilet. I was then told they were going to introduce end-of-life medication, which would be midazolam and, if needed, and morphine, and I was shocked.
I've ascertained that the sedative that she was given is one called midazolam.
That's correct.
And we've heard about midazolam from other witnesses, and I think it is associated with end-of-life care.
She was also given 2 other drugs that were part of an end-of-life protocol. The funeral directors was the ones that says to me, they says they used to have a thing called like a cremation form 4 or something. If they had an issue with the cause of death, which was on the death certificate, then they would get in touch with us people or whatever, they'd tick a box. And I asked them directly, I says, if you still had the forms, if they still existed today, because they done away with them, they stopped doing them, I says, would you have ticked that box to say that you've got a concern with the cause of death of my brother's death certificate? And he says to me, yes.
I'm personally not convinced my mum had COVID.
So definitely some evidence that a lot of us know, obviously, anecdotally from what happened to us and from other people we know. My father-in-law was a midazolam death in 2021. My mother died of, she was on a ventilator in 2021. I wasn't allowed to see her because she died in America and I wasn't vaccinated and I wouldn't test. So we know about these detrimental effects on families and people. And I'm certainly not discounting anything about what people are saying in the testimonies, but I think what we do need to look at is what is the actual scope of the inquiry? What can an inquiry do to hold people to account for what did happen, other than just saying, oh, let's not do that next time? And how much is it costing the Scottish taxpayers? If we go to the next slide, we can see here the cost from the start of inquiry, so assuming that was sometime before the 31st of March 2022, up until the 30th of June 2024, has been a total of £26.1 million that has been spent on the inquiry. And as I said, we're only about a third of the way done, at least when it comes to the hearings and the things that are, coming out of that and all of the work and the staff and so on. I've had a lot of discussion about this on X the last few days, and if you would like to get involved in this conversation, please follow me on X. My ID is DIANE UKC, so that's Diane UKC. We see some different ranges of opinions about the inquiries. Alex Mitchell, who we've worked with before on the UK column, has said, okay, so we have such a small amount of the claims for the vaccine injured, both in England and in Scotland, that are getting awarded vaccine damage payments because the vaccine damage payment scheme is so terribly limiting, but yet we're spending millions on these inquiries. And I've said myself, well, if we look at the fact that we know that there weren't excess deaths in 2020, but the excess deaths actually started once we got into the vaccine rollout in 2021 and going forward, that the fact that they're still calling this a pandemic investigation is a problem for me, because to me it just expands the narrative that there was a pandemic when we know it was actually, vaccine damage and isolation and midazolam and other things that actually killed people. I would just like to call out once again, Dave, Biology Phenom. He has a Substack here that has a lot of other, in addition to the video clips he's put on Twitter, he has extensive information on his Substack as well. So I don't have time to go into all of it, obviously, but I would encourage everyone to check that out to see what he's actually uncovered, which has been quite substantial. And again, I will continue to do some formal sort of analysis of some of the transcripts and the witness statements and report on those in the coming months, Brian.
Diane, thank you very much for that excellent segment. To me, there can be no doubt that the government has been attacking elderly people, and they've simply been cold, in my opinion. And if the government is prepared to do this with the elderly, they're prepared to do a lot more with the younger living. It is time for people in this country to really understand the venom that now exists amongst politicians, many of whom simply will still not tell the truth. Now, if you're with us today and you like what the UK column is doing, then please do support us. Your financial contribution of £5 a month keeps us going. And we hope with enough supporters, we want to be expanding to be able to bring you more news and across a whole wider spectrum of subjects. So thank you to everybody supporting us. If you want us to do more, please give us additional support or sign up as a member if you're not already one. At the moment, excuse me, please share material. We put out our material in order to spread the word as far and wide as possible. Facebook is still not engaging with us, but we're still challenging them as to why we've been shadow banned. And making a purchase from the UK column shop is always a big boost for us. And of course, that shop is available for people who are members and non-members. Now, perhaps back onto the subject of what's happening in our country. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, I've got the third interview with J. Michael Waller, former CIA operative and counterintelligence expert. He's going to be looking in particular about the Trump assassination attempt, but he will also be talking about the Capitol riots in 2021 and the subversive demise of the US intelligence services, which we see a mirror of in the UK. Now, a big thank you to one of our viewers who sent in this email pointing out that there's been changes in the way places are named, or at least in the way they're described. So South Wales has now become South with a small s. And what the person has said is that if you follow this change of language and spelling, it leads you back to EU objectives. And he's particularly looking at EU policies in Objective 1, 2 and 3. I think this particular gentleman is absolutely on the button, and perhaps the segment to follow in the news, excuse me, will help people see through some of this. Now, we'd also like to say that Agenda 21, Your Life in Their Hands, is still selling. People are very impressed with this publication. So if you haven't bought one yet and you'd like one, I suggest you get your order in as soon as you can. And on the happier side of life, 23rd, 26th of August, we've got Freedom Music Festival by Hope Sussex, and lots of really good music in a fun 4-day family event. So you may consider going to that to meet some new friends, or to at least have some good discussion. And also UK column on location event in Bristol for the 19th of October. Early bird tickets still on sale. So if you haven't got a ticket under that scheme, I suggest you get on board. But we're looking forward to meeting our supporters at that event in Bristol. Now, let's get back to the subject of the demise of UK. Has this been accidental? I don't think so. Let's jump all the way back to the year 2000 and the concept of a new class. This is the quote, and it came from the Centre for Policy Studies. The Prime Minister has a vision of a new Britain. Central to this vision is the creation of a new class, a new elite placed in positions of authority who will propagate the spirit of the age and spread the principles of the third way across Britain. So democracy going out of the window, because basically Tony Blair and his colleagues will be bringing in a new elite. And if you don't know what the third way is, then I suggest you have a look at this Guardian article. Credit where it's due. It's a very good article about what the third way is. and talking about Professor Anthony Giddens, the man who helped Labour create it. And if you look at the bottom there, you'll see Bill Clinton is mentioned a bit. Now, way back in 2006, we were warning about a charity that was supported very strongly by the Labour Party, particularly from the office of the Deputy Prime Minister. This was Common Purpose. And what we were talking about in 2006 was how this pernicious charity was controlling cities by putting its people in the structure of the city. So if we can imagine this, it's almost like a virus infecting a whole level of systems, from the council leaders through chief executive, through social services, and into the regional government offices, the government office of the Southwest, the regional development agencies, but also the police, local universities, Chamber of Commerce, and yes, unfortunately, people with criminal records or even perversions. So that's the system taking control of a city, but this was a subset of a much bigger system exerting control through the European Union, through UK's democratic government, and through all of our institutions, the civil service, the public sector, the quangos, the government offices of the regions, the regional assemblies, and the regional development agencies, plus wider society and the private sector, and youth and school children. And if we put in red the common purpose system, the thing which went hand in glove with it was the use of neurolinguistics and nudging, so that people at every level of this pyramid of power were coming under control of this new system for future leaders. Now, if we have a look at the Tories, they were pushing big society, and in his March 2010 Conservative Party conference speech, Cameron announced that the big society was a guiding philosophy, a society where the leading force for progress is social responsibility, not state control. It includes a whole set of unifying approaches, breaking state monopolies, allowing charities, social enterprises and companies to provide public services, making government more accountable. Well, weasel words, because government control has increased while the power of communities has diminished. But what was important is that Conservative Home blog site revealed that this plan is directly based on the successful community organising movement established by Saul Alinsky in the United States, and it's trained generations of community organisers, including President Obama himself. And if we couple that with these revealing quotes, which we've mentioned many times and will continue to mention, this was Nicholas Bowles MP saying that the Prime Minister and his Deputy Nick Clegg want their people power revolution to unleash chaotic effects across local communities. Chaotic in our vocabulary is a good thing. He's talking about the Conservative vocabulary. And if we bring in a second one to reinforce this, this was Cameron's ally and one-time advisor, Danny Kruger. He was forced to resign as a Tory candidate in Sedgefield after he was quoted as saying that the Conservatives' plan to introduce a period of creative destruction in the public services. So we've got big society with the Tories, and excuse me, we've got the Third Sector magazine here pointing out that they were surprised that an organisation called Locality had got a big government contract to effectively be manipulating society, but it was using the ideas of the Brazilian Paulo Freire, and they expected Citizens UK that used the Saul Alinsky method to get the contract. But what we can say with certainty is that the government was engaging non-government organisations in order to use manipulative techniques to take control of society in the UK. And if you want to know more about Saul Alinsky, well, here's a quote: "True revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, put on suits, and infiltrate the system from within." Think about Tony Blair, think about Keir Starmer, think about Cameron, think even about Eric Pickles. And let's pop him up on screen, because this is a diagram which UK Column produced many years ago, warning about the Tories' big society. And if we bring it into focus, we'd put Saul Alinsky at the top with some of the other key players. But have a look at the language being used: community empowerment, national citizen service, opening up public services, community first fund, social investment market, social action. And they were bringing in a commission for the compact. This is all revolutionary language. And alongside it came the use of big money through big society capital. And there were the major banks involved. Let's just see if we can get this one to move on. On it goes, bringing in creeping state legislation and doctrine to control our lives. And a lot of projects: the Big Lunch, Interfaith Week, A Year of Service, the Young Advisors, Youth United, Near Neighbours, and English Learning. And all this was coming together in a big society network, which was going to bring people together in order to implement the state's policy. This was nothing to do with building communities. And so we were happy to label it the big lie. And alongside this, we had the brainwashing, which was occurring through Common Purpose and the nudge system. And we just run through this pretty quickly, but these were some of the key people operating at the time: Cameron, Francis Maud, Gus O'Donnell, Jeff Mulgan, Julia Middleton, the then chief executive of Common Purpose. Sir Bob Kerslake came in. And then what do we have? We had very powerful people working through the nudge unit with French neuro specialists such as Olivier Ollier from France, who was part of Sarkozy's personal team, and they were discussing how UK society could be manipulated. All of this research is unique to the UK Column. Nobody has ever done this level of analysis in the attack on this country. What were they after? Our minds, a bay, as the TV says. And of course, the big society here largely came under the hand of Eric Pickles, the Communities Minister, who called himself an unlikely revolution, but stated that the revolution would begin here with his good self. Now, alongside all of this, you need control of the media, and embedded and alongside the big society networks are the media networks, of which the Public Service Broadcasting Trust is one example, backed by the ITV. It mobilises individuals in large numbers to participate in civil society, democracy, and their local communities, and using popular mass media, PSBT, appeals to people's self-interest and nudges them to take positive social action. I wonder if that was happening in the demonstrations that Ben was talking about. But before we leave on this, here's Antonio Gramsci. And he believed that, he was an Italian communist theories man. He believed that you could bring about a revolution in the state by pursuing the steady incremental subversion of free societies. And really, this is alongside the same doctrine pursued by the Fabian socialists, who chose patient gradualism rather than violent insurrection as the most effective means to collectivise society. And I'll just pop this one up on screen to end. I can't give you the provenance, so I'm just taking it at face value. But somebody sent me what was a clip, which they said was published by a judge back in 1954, where he said a half page of his textbook outlined a few steps to overturn a democracy, divide the nation, create racial strife, cause distrust of the police and authority, swarm the nation's borders, engender the military strength to weaken it, overburden citizens with unfair taxation, encourage civil rioting and discourage accountability for all crime, control the balloting, control all media. And I'll leave the audience to reflect on that, but whoever wrote it, it seems to me pretty pertinent. But Ben, there's worse to come, because we're now going to use AI in helping to nudge communities into the right action.
We are indeed. Well, that's certainly the direction that we're heading in. We're going to go to Demos, which is, I think, probably right now the most influential think tank in the UK. Demos was founded by Jeff Mulgan, who Brian's just mentioned, and they used to share an office with Common Purpose, who we obviously talk about all the time here on the column. One of the things I love about working with UK Column is just the depth and the heritage. That research was fantastic, Brian. I'm going to have to watch that back a couple of times, I think, to get all of the detail out of it. But Demos are really setting the agenda now for the radical corporatist left, which is basically what the Starmer government has turned out to be. This is pre-election. This image you can see here, you've got Miriam Levin from Demos, you've got Georgia Gould, who at the time was the mayor of Camden. She's now Labour MP for Queen's Park and Maida Vale. And she's very much a right-hand lady to Keir Starmer. She's always hanging around with him. You also have there Lisa Witter from Apolitical Foundation, who are trying to execute an audacious takeover of global governments. And I spoke about them about a month ago on the show. And then Claudia Chalice from Democracy Next, who I've spoken about a few times. And this still comes from an event that happened back in March. And I've taken a few clips out of it. But if we could just get that back on screen quickly, I just want to reinforce what you're looking at here. On screen, and I can't go through all the connections because I haven't got time, but you're looking at the combined interests of Common Purpose, George Soros's Open Societies, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bilderberg Group, Chatham House, the Obama Foundation, and now the UK Labour Party and Her Majesty's government. That's what's happening on screen right in front of you. Now, as I said, this is from March. The discussion was technology-enabled citizens' assemblies to radically reshape global democracy. And we're just going to hear a quick introduction from Claudia Chalice from Democracy Next.
The way that I've been kind of approaching this work for a while has been thinking about how can we really be building new democratic institutions for another democratic paradigm, and how does our whole mindset shift actually about what that entails, what that means for power and relationships when it's an institution and not just a tool. But I think there's pros and cons to these approaches. So I prepared a few slides as well, just a little bit about what is Democracy Next and what is the work that we're doing on these topics, our role as an international research and learning hub, because I completely share that spirit of really needing to learn from what's working, what's not working, and having that approach to iteration and going off of that, and then sharing from two key bits of work that we're doing around pushing systemic change with cities, and also really pushing innovation for things to keep evolving with an approach to employing technology within assemblies.
So Claudia Chalice is building new democratic institutions. That is the brief that she has received. I believe she's received that from Jeff Mulgan via the Rockefeller Foundation. I haven't got time to explain to you exactly why. I'm going to come down to that on a show over the next few weeks. But that's what she's working on, new democratic institutions. And we know that Labour Party policy is to get rid of the House of Lords and replace it with an assembly. And that's exactly what these people are working on. We're going to talk about two more clips. I highly recommend going to watch the whole of this hour-long presentation. It's absolutely critical to see this, to understand what's happening right now. But we're going to talk very briefly about the approach to cities, because this is about progressing the C40 cities and World Economic Forum agenda around urbanisation. Let's hear the next clip.
How could we change the way in which decisions related to housing and infrastructure, mobility get taken every time they have to be taken? And so we did this work because we see these sorts of issues are the same all over the world. Before we launched this, we did interviews with people in different countries, those different roles. Actually, we spoke to some of your colleagues in Camden even, I remember at that stage. And there's just a shared sense of these problems being shared in cities around the world. And we really believe that we don't just need different policy solutions to these issues that we're facing all over the place. We really need a different way in which we're taking these decisions on an ongoing basis. And these new governance models can help break through deadlocks and give legitimacy to the sometimes hard choices that need to be made that require trade-offs.
So we can't sell our policies to people. Therefore, we're creating a piece of technology which would allow us to force these policies through on the basis that they just have to get on with it and trade-offs need to be made. There's nothing democratic about that at all. This is all, as we've kind of touched on, very much technology enabled, right? And they're building AI into the entire process of selection, sortition, deliberation, decision making, absolutely everything. This is happening in collaboration with MIT Centre for Constructive Communication. We could just bring that up onto screen. That would be fantastic. Thank you. So you can just see here, that's the end-to-end process that they've mapped out for how these things work. And they're embedding AI into the green sections, right? So all the way through the process, they're going to be introducing technologies to nudge and usher people through the decision-making process and to get them going ultimately in the right direction, right? This is what this stuff is for. Now, the final clip, the first thing I would encourage you to do is to just, in the first few seconds, watch Georgia Gould's reaction when Claudia Chalice talks about keeping a public record of what's going on in these assemblies. It's absolutely fascinating. Let's run the clip.
And then the last thing is about actually having a better public archive of what's happening in these assemblies. Like, we have public archives of what happens in our city council decision-making moments, in our parliaments, and we don't really have a proper public archive of what's happening in our assembly processes. This is an example of the kind of archives that the MIT team has done for some of the community dialogue works, but you can also, again, go in and have what happened and what took place grounded in voice. And we want to be working on different things, like if you have a final set of recommendations, is there a way you could kind of listen to and see what was the initial genesis of that idea and what were parts of the conversation that led to it? How did people get there? So anyways, we're working on a whole bunch of different things that can be done in this space, but I think it's important for the kind of trustworthiness of these processes, and I think for the kind of history and the legacy of them, and I think connected maybe to what I see as one of the bigger picture things that needs to happen of moving actually to decision-making assemblies. And this is not about replacing politicians, but I think that if there is going to be an assembly that is commissioned, I think we're actually at a place where we should experiment with this being a decision-making body and exploring what does that mean for accountability and legitimacy. And I think having a public archive of what happened in this process is incredibly important when we're going in that direction.
I don't know if you saw it, but Georgia Gould became very uncomfortable when it was suggested that someone might want to keep a public record. But we do need to keep a public record, according to Claudia Chalice, because we're soon going to be seeing decision-making assemblies that override politicians. And as far as she's concerned, and I believe everyone sitting on the panel there, that is the direction that we're going in.
Yes, Ben, a thought in my head was Claudia elected to Democracy Next? That was just a little question. Thank you for that. Now, very, very quickly here, I was researching the amount of arms going to fuel the war in the Middle East, arms from UK. I came across this July House of Commons Library briefing, and I got into it and I just found one sentence that really got me thinking. So initially here it's talking about what had happened. The International Court of Justice, South Africa has accused Israel of international humanitarian law violations. And as I went on through, I found this. David Lammy, when Foreign Secretary in 2024, called on the government to publish the legal advice it had received on the granting of export licenses to Israel. The government resisted such calls, saying legal advice to ministers is confidential. So if you want to know what the government is capable of, particularly under Mr. Starmer, but also, of course, under previous prime ministers, then the public is not going to be allowed to know what legal advice they have and have not had. But you would have thought if they'd have had positive legal advice to allow them, in this case, to export arms, there would be little problem in allowing the public to see what that guidance was. But the government wants to know every secret amongst every individual in UK, but the public are not to know what the government is up to. I think we know what sort of government this is. It's called a dictatorship. Diane, let's bring you back, because if we want to talk about where society's really got to, perhaps going to, we need to be on the subject. Well, what do we need to have a look at? We need to have a look at the games.
So again, I watched the closing ceremony of the Olympics last night. As is our tradition here at UK Column, we watch and read things so you don't have to. And I wanted to cover the closing ceremony because the opening ceremony created so much controversy for a lot of reasons. And we heard the official stories, and we all know what we saw and what we have talked about on here. So what the BBC said about the closing ceremony of the Olympics was that it was sensational. It was brilliant. I even watched a bit of BBC Breakfast this morning, again, so you don't have to. And they talked about how sad they were to see it was all ended because Paris was amazing. And, oh, we're so sad and we can't wait until 2026 in Italy and 2028, which is going to be back in the City of Angels in the United States. So what I did is I took a little bit of video with my phone and looking at the TV last night as I was watching this. And so the vision, so we saw this kind of all of these, eventually it came across with the Olympic rings. So there was some that came down from the ceiling or the top of the stadium, and they came together with this ring where these sort of shady characters were sort of convening all in one place. Again, officially what was said in the mainstream media is that the character's quest sees it encounter Nike, the goddess of victory, which is linked to the ancient Olympic Games. And it takes on the features of various statues, which can be seen in the Louvre. And the conclusion was the piece seeing the Golden Voyager itself elevated by a cast of dancers underneath those 5 Olympic rings before fireworks were set off. So if we take a look at the next slide, these are just some still images that I took that were of particular interest. Again, they're very dark. You can see possibly better images on social media and elsewhere, but I wanted to capture these as well as I could, because I think it also focuses really well on how dark they were. Some things that I saw just from the very abstract way of seeing that darkness, which was actually how it looked on my television last night, was I thought I saw the Grim Reaper playing guitar. I thought I saw a winged angel, which I did, which they go into more detail if you read the official story behind the mythology that it was supposedly explaining, and some other sort of shady characters and things going on, pentagrams, triangles, lines. I saw red eyes come out at various points in some people. So just to ask the question, according to this so-called Golden Voyager character, if you look at the next slide, the first thing that I saw and my husband saw, and Debbie Evans, who I was sort of watching this with, the first thing we said was Baphomet when we saw this Golden Voyager character. Someone in the chat box, one of our viewers, suggested Anubis, the Egyptian god of death, which I was not aware of. They both look very similar to the Golden Voyager. But I think we have to ask the question of, what is it they're trying to tell us here? And maybe we can't say exactly what's going to happen from what we saw last night. But if we go back to London in 2012 in the Olympics, and we sort of saw how they told the story of the pandemic again in inverted commas that was to come, what are they telling us now in 2024 is going to happen in the next few years? And what is really interesting is that the handover, which is going into the 2028 Summer Olympics, which will be in Los Angeles. We had Tom Cruise falling out of a plane, about Tom Cruise, really, looking quite old. I have to say, I liked him when I was younger. I can't say that at all anymore. And then they transferred over to Los Angeles on the beach, and they had Billie Eilish, they had Dr. Dre, they had Snoop Dogg, and all of these performances going on, and made it look light and bright. I just really hope that we are able to reach up to 2028 when this wonderful light Olympics in the City of Angels is going to happen. But I guess we'll have to see what happens for the next 4 years. But based on this dystopian presentation, to me, it didn't give me a good feeling for the next few years. I don't know about you, Brian.
Not at all. And I think people in our chat box have summed it up. They've described it as horrible, demonic and dark. and somebody has said it's witchcraft. So people are clearly recognising this, but of course these major events are promoted and funded by our own governments, and therefore we must come to the conclusion that this type of ideology is buried inside our governments. Should we therefore be surprised that we're seeing an absolute breakdown in society, a lack of human kindness, and as we've covered in today's episode, yourself in particular, we're seeing an attack on elderly people. Death is now something to be encouraged. It's an active process. It's not something that is to be held back at all costs. So I think we're into very, very dark times. And I'm going to end by saying, Ben, thank you very much for your analysis. This is exactly the in-depth analysis we need to do in order to show people what is happening in UK. So I hope you'll be doing more along those lines. Diane, thank you for your segment there. But for the wider audience, we are into perilous times. We are being attacked. This is very clear. Can we do something about it? Yes, it requires a lot of people to stand up and be counted in a peaceful way. And I'll just end by reflecting on a wonderful monologue Mr. Bean gave a few days ago, in which he said if we want to counter the censorship, then we need to speak out more, not remain silent. And I think those were very good words. We'll leave it there. If you're a UK Column member, we'll be back for UK Column Extra in a few moments. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.